Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into something that kind of blends science fiction with maybe just science.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you've shared with me this really interesting scientific paper
Mm-hmm.
that explores what's called the Saluran hypothesis. And then just to kind of shake things up a little bit, throw in another perspective,
Yeah.
we've got some selections from the Law of One.
Right.
So are you ready to explore this idea that maybe
Mm.
there were ancient civilizations here on Earth millions of years before us?
It's a fascinating thought experiment, isn't it? And it kind of forces us to think about, how we define civilization in the first place.
Well, yeah, and that's what I love about this particular paper.
Okay.
The title alone had me intrigued.
Oh, yeah.
It's called The Silurian Hypothesis. Would it be possible to detect an industrial civilization in the geological record?
Oh.
Just even thinking about that, the sheer scope of time that we're talking about here,
Mm-hmm.
it just seems like, how could we possibly find any evidence?
Well, you're talking about trying to find a needle in a haystack that's been through a compactor and then buried and then had a few mountains grow on top of it.
Right. It's like gone, gone, gone.
It's a lot of change over that kind of time scale.
It is.
And that's exactly what the authors of this paper point out, is that if we're talking about really, really, really old civilizations, millions of years,
Yeah.
most of the direct evidence would be erased. We're
Yeah.
talking fossils, tools, buildings,
Yeah.
completely gone.
So no ancient iPhones buried in the bedrock.
Probably not.
Darn. Okay, so if we can't find any direct evidence like that,
Yeah.
what can we look for?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. The paper proposes this idea that maybe we should be looking for indirect evidence,
Okay.
specifically for unusual patterns in the geological strata that could hint at, some sort of industrial activity.
Okay, so give me an example.
They call these techno-signatures.
Oh, techno-signatures. I like that.
Yeah.
That-
So, okay, kind of Star Trek.
It is kind of Star Trek-y. Give me an example.
Well, let's think about, the effects of fossil fuels.
Okay.
We can see right now, because of all the fossil fuels that we're burning, we can see shifts in carbon isotopes.
Right.
So what if there were similar types of shifts that were detected from millions of years ago?
Okay, yeah.
Another thing that the paper talks about is plastic.
Uh-huh.
Now, this stuff is incredibly persistent.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
It is. So if you were to find unusual plastic compounds deep down in the sediment layers,
Yeah,
that would be pretty strange,
that would be pretty weird.
to say the least.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah, plastic I get. Like it's
that makes sense.
kind of,
Yeah.
unfortunately it's everywhere now.
It is.
But what about other things that wouldn't necessarily be like,
Yeah.
screaming pollution, but would still maybe helped at a civilization having been there?
Well, the paper talks about looking at spikes in certain metal concentrations in sediment. For example, there's this event that geologists know about called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum.
Okay.
It happened roughly 56 million years ago.
Wow.
And what we see is just this massive release of carbon into the atmosphere and the global temperature spikes.
Wow.
Now, typically the thought is that maybe it was volcanic activity that caused that.
Yeah.
But what if it was something else?
What if it was like
Yeah.
industry on a scale that we can
Just-
barely even imagine?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
that would be pretty amazing to think about.
And that's that million-dollar question, right? How do we differentiate between a natural event, like a volcano,
Right.
and a potential techno-signature from a civilization?
Yeah, and it seems like this paper is really kind of acknowledging that, like, hey, this is really hard to prove. They're not saying, like, we've got the smoking gun, but it's more like, here are some things to consider.
It's opening up these new avenues of investigation.
Right.
It's challenging our assumptions about what we think we know about the geological record.
Yeah, and that's what I love about science, is that it's not afraid to ask these really big questions
Right.
and kind of put it out there and be like, we don't know.
Absolutely.
And it makes you realize just how much we don't know about our planet's history.
It really does.
And that kind of brings us to our second source for today's deep dive, and that's the Law of One.
Okay.
And this is where we get into some more metaphysical kind of ideas.
Quite a shift in perspective.
Yeah, so the Law of One claims to be this channeled communication from an extraterrestrial being named Ra. And Ra
Okay.
has a lot to say about ancient civilizations here on Earth.
Interesting.
And according to Ra, these civilizations were far more advanced than what we understand through our history books and our current understanding. Like we're talking pyramids used for healing, crystals as technology.
Right.
And wait for it, wanderers?
Wanderers.
Yeah.
What are those?
So wanderers are like these souls from higher densities of consciousness that incarnate on Earth to help us evolve.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept. It kind of makes you think like, what am I doing here? What's my purpose?
He does, yeah.
So anyway, let's bring it back to the main question.
Okay.
Could a civilization have existed millions of years ago, and would they have left behind any traces that we could detect? And the law of one seems to suggest that maybe not in the way that we're thinking.
That's really interesting because if we're just focused on finding, plastic bottles or rusted car parts or whatever we think a civilization from millions of years ago would have left behind,
right,
we might be missing something really big.
Yeah.
The law of one is suggesting that these really advanced civilizations might operate on a completely different level.
Okay, so almost like a different dimension.
Yeah.
Or a different level of being, a different...
Yeah, something that we can't even really grasp with our current understanding.
Okay, so this is interesting. Now I'm really intrigued. So we've got this scientific paper that's saying, okay, here's how we can look for these techno-signatures in the geological record.
Right.
And then we've got the law of one that's saying, well, maybe they wouldn't even leave those kinds of traces.
Maybe they were so advanced that they wouldn't even leave those kinds of signatures behind.
Wow. Okay, so it's almost like we're looking at two sides of the same coin here, right?
Yeah, I like that. Two sides of the same coin.
And both sides are...
It's the same question, but a different perspective.
And that's what makes this deep dive so exciting, is we're not just looking for answers, but we're kind of expanding our understanding of what questions to even ask.
I like that.
Right. So I guess I'd ask you, what's kind of standing out to you so far from both of these sources?
Well, I think it's really interesting that both the scientific approach and the law of one perspective, they both seem to touch on this idea of a civilization's impact. Yeah.
But they approach it in very different ways.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, I think.
It is.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dig into that a little bit more. So the scientists are looking for measurable changes.
Right.
In the geological record, right? Like those carbon isotope shifts that you were talking about from fossil fuel use.
Exactly.
But then the law of one is talking about it more in terms of energy and consciousness.
Yes, and it talks about civilizations that are focused on what they call service to self.
Okay.
So they're driven by greed and power.
Okay.
And this creates kind of a negative energetic imprint on the planet.
Okay.
It's like spiritual pollution.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's like whether we're talking about dumping plastic in the ocean or, like you said, this negative energy radiating out into the cosmos, both have these consequences.
Yeah, and those consequences ripple outward.
It makes you wonder, like, if a civilization millions of years ago wiped itself out, could we still feel that?
It's a really good question.
Like, what would that look like?
Yeah.
It pushes us to go beyond just that material evidence that the scientists are looking for.
Right.
And it really highlights that interconnectedness that the law of one talks about so much.
Yeah.
Actions have consequences not just on the physical level, but on a deeper energetic level as well.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we are going to take a quick break, and we'll be back in just a moment to delve even deeper into this fascinating topic.
Sounds good. I'm excited. It really does make you think about, like those cycles that we see in so many different areas of life.
Yeah, that's like everything's kind of cyclical.
Everything's connected.
Yeah.
And there are these patterns.
And that actually kind of brings us to another point where these sources seem to converge a little bit.
Okay.
And that is this idea of cycles.
Yeah.
So the law of one talks about these cycles of growth and evolution, like civilizations rising and falling as they grapple with their own choices. And then on the other hand, we have geology, which reveals its own cycles.
Right.
Like ice ages, warming periods, mass extinctions.
Yeah, it's almost as if the Earth itself goes through these grand cycles, and we're just along for the ride.
Yeah. So where do we fit into all of this? Are we just doomed to repeat the same mistakes as these hypothetical ancient civilizations?
Well, the law of one seems to suggest that we do have the power to choose.
Okay.
Ra talks about this potential for a civilization to evolve towards what he calls service to others.
Okay.
Which is this path of compassion and harmony.
Okay.
And, potentially that could lead to a more sustainable and fulfilling future.
It sounds pretty utopian.
It does.
Right. But it also suggests that those choices aren't easy.
No, not at all.
Because even Ra talks about how, he encounters resistance from those who are clinging to power
Yeah,
and self-interest.
absolutely. And that's something that we see
Yeah.
time and time again throughout history, right?
It feels very relevant
It does, doesn't it?
to what we're experiencing today.
Yeah, it really highlights those timeless challenges, the struggle between, selfishness and compassion,
Right.
short-term gain and long-term sustainability.
Yeah.
It seems like that's just woven into the fabric of what it means to be a civilization.
So I guess the question is, are we doomed? Or is there hope?
Well, I think we have the potential
Okay.
to choose a different path,
Okay.
but it requires this shift in consciousness,
Oh.
a recognition of our interconnectedness, and a willingness to prioritize the well-being of everyone,
Right.
not just ourselves.
It's a tall order.
It is.
But I like how you frame it in terms of potential,
Yeah.
because it does make it feel hopeful in a way. Like
Yeah.
maybe we're not just stuck in this loop
Right.
of repeating the same patterns over and over
It's
again.
not predetermined.
Right.
We have the ability to choose.
Yeah, and maybe by even just talking about these things and exploring these ideas,
Mhm.
we're already kind of nudging ourselves
Yeah.
in a new direction.
I think so.
Maybe that's being a little bit too optimistic.
I don't know. I think it's good to be optimistic.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Okay, well, there's still more to uncover in these sources, so we're going to keep digging. Are you ready?
I'm ready when you are.
Okay, so we've been talking about these advanced civilizations, from that scientific perspective of the Saluran hypothesis and then that more metaphysical lens of the law of one. But there's this one passage from Ra that really kind of stuck with me,
Okay.
where Ra talks about time and space being an illusion.
Right.
And I got to be honest, that one kind of went over my head a little bit.
Yeah, it's definitely a concept that kind of stretches our everyday understanding of reality.
Yeah.
Ra is essentially suggesting that our perception of time as linear, past, present, future is limited.
Okay.
It's a product of our third density consciousness.
Okay, so like
Yeah.
time is more fluid
Yes.
than we normally think?
More fluid than we can even imagine, probably.
Okay. I'm trying to wrap my brain around this.
I think a good way to think about it is to imagine a being
Okay.
that exists outside of our linear time.
Okay.
And this being could perceive all of time, past, present, future, as this single unified whole.
Okay.
So from that perspective, the idea of a civilization existing millions of years ago might not be as strange as it seems to us.
Whoa. Okay, so are you saying that the law of one is suggesting time travel is real? Or that these ancient civilizations could still exist in some other dimension of time?
It's not necessarily about literal time travel as we often think of it.
Okay.
It's more about recognizing that our perception of time might be the limiting factor here in understanding the true nature of reality.
Okay, so our methods of searching for them
Exactly.
might be inadequate. It's almost like trying to catch a whale with a butterfly net or something.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
Okay, so that this is where like open-minded skepticism comes in, right?
I think so.
We need to balance that scientific rigor of looking for that material evidence with the understanding that maybe our understanding of reality isn't complete.
Yeah, we have to be willing to expand our thinking
Yeah.
beyond those current limitations that we have.
So we can't just dismiss the law of one as like pure fantasy, but we also can't just accept it as like gospel truth either.
Exactly.
We need to use our brains.
Yes, critical thinking skills.
Yeah, exactly.
To weigh the evidence,
Yeah.
consider all the possibilities, and come to our own conclusions.
Yeah. This whole deep dive has been a great reminder that learning is a process.
It
It's
is.
not a destination, right?
Absolutely.
It's about asking questions, exploring these different ideas, and just being open to the possibility that we don't know everything.
Embracing the mystery.
Yeah. Embracing the mystery. I like that.
Yeah.
Well, I think this has been a really fascinating conversation.
It has.
And I really appreciate you taking the time to kind of walk us through these different perspectives.
No, it's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners out there, keep asking questions, keep an open mind, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of our world and beyond.
Absolutely. There's always more to discover.